We'll go ahead and get started. I hope you are as excited as I am to listen to our speaker tonight. When I received confirmation that he was going to be able to come here, I was literally very pleased, almost ecstatic. Bob Jensen is a phenomenal scholar and researcher who has been a radical fighting against the effects of violence against women for nearly 3 decades at this point. The typical way to do an academic introduction would be to run through an extensive list of his publications and accomplishments and fill you in on his biography, but I think, as you will see, Bob is not a typical scholar, and so I will not insult him with a typical introduction. Suffice it to say, he has authored or co-authored over 8 books and is working on a 9th at this point. He has had numerous articles published in a variety of publications, including the New York Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and more radical publications like Z-Net and Extra, Counterpunch, etc. He's a gifted researcher and a writer, and his talent, I believe, is in his ability to reach a large audience of non-academics and non-specialists with a very important message. For my own part, I first met Bob nearly 20 years ago when I walked into a graduate class as a beaming new graduate student on critical legal theory. I thought I was going to be sitting on a class that was typical First Amendment law, a little bit of case law, a little bit of philosophical conundrums, and I quickly learned that was not the case. In that class, what Bob impressed upon all of us was that something like free speech is not in fact free. It comes with a cost. And what he impressed on all of us, whether we agreed with him or not necessarily, was to really ask the hard questions. And at the heart of that class was the question of who pays for free speech. Tonight, Bob's going to be speaking not so much about free speech, but about pornography. And his career has been one dedicated to talking about questions of social justice. And tonight, his talk is very much about social justice because what he will be speaking to is another difficult question. What's the cost of our pleasure? Who pays for the pleasure that we take? So without further ado, I'm going to turn the stage over to Bob. Please give him a warm welcome and enjoy the talk.
Well, I'm glad Shane reminded me of that seminar because I never really told you. I was really unhappy with the quality of your final paper, and I've got some notes here I'd like to... Oh, just kidding. One of our star students at UT has gone on to great things. Well, usually speakers stand up and say it's really great to be here, and nobody really believes them. But I'm going to tell you it's really great to be here, and it really is for lots of special reasons. I, as a young man, just out of college, starting my career in journalism, I actually was an employee, a staff employee here at St. John's in the early 1980s, 30 years ago now. I was the news and public information officer here. I helped tell the world about all the great things St. John's was doing. And it was a great 2 years of my life. I really enjoyed the campus. And I went on to other things, more work in journalism, eventually to academic life. But it's been a real treat to be back. So thanks for being here. Even with the cold, it's been enjoyable. And thank you to Shane for helping make this possible. And I've already spoken to 3 different classes today, maybe met some of you. I'm looking out at how many of you I saw today, and a great faculty. And like any institution, St. Ben's and St. John's can be critiqued and should be. But there is something I think very special that happens here, and I'm glad to be back. The title today is Pornography Immoral. I need to do a little preliminary work about what I mean by this. First of all, I should identify the position from which I speak. I consider myself part of a feminist movement, and more specifically, part of a radical feminist movement. 2 terms people usually don't embrace, radical and feminist in the United States today, but that is my intellectual and political home from which I talk about these things. And I also speak as a Christian, someone who belongs to, in my case, a Protestant church, and takes that tradition very seriously. Now, you might imagine that radical feminist means that my interpretation of the Christian text and tradition might be a little different than what you would expect for a guy from Texas. So I just want to make it clear, right? There's not going to be no Jesus preaching. Not going to be thumping no Bibles. I'm not going to be carried away by the Spirit, just by the spirit of good intellectual exchange. But that Christian perspective, I think, is very important, and we'll get to that later. The other preliminary business is about what we mean by the term pornography. So if we're going to ask the question, is pornography immoral, we should have some understanding of what we mean by the term. And although defining pornography and defining obscenity, the legal concept attached to sexually explicit material, has always been contentious, I think there is an understanding of the basics of what we mean by that term that allow us to go forward in conversation. That we don't need a legally precise definition to have a conversation here tonight. So by pornography, I just mean that category of sexually explicit material that people seek out when they go to pornographic websites. I realize that's a little circular of a definition, but we all know what that means. Graphic, sexually explicit material that is now readily available, not only in traditional forms, print and film through DVDs, but also, of course, now ubiquitous on the internet. But I'm going to use the term also in a specific feminist connotation, that radical feminist critique. I don't have time to rehearse the whole history of the radical feminist critique of pornography, where it came from, how it emerged. But I'm going to summarize it in one sentence, that the radical feminist critique of pornography, that political, intellectual position from which I speak, understood pornography not just as sex on film, but sex of a particular type. Sex in the context of the domination-subordination dynamic that is central in patriarchy. There's another word you don't hear a lot in contemporary American political discourse. Patriarchy. A social system defined by male power, literally rule by the father. Patriarchy, a system that assumes the naturalness of male domination. Now, I realize that we are not a patriarchal society in the way we might have been in previous centuries, but I'm still going to assert, and we can talk more about what it means to understand contemporary America as a patriarchal society. So, from the radical feminist critique of pornography, pornography is not just sex on film, it's sex in the context of this domination-subordination dynamic that is so central to patriarchy. It's the, you could say, the sexualization of that domination-subordination dynamic. Taking that dynamic of male power, the assertion of male power, and sexualizing it, making it erotic. And the original women who pioneered this critique recognized that that was the way to understand contemporary sexually explicit material. Let me give you one more way to think about pornography before we go on and talk about some of the deeper issues. In the book that I published about this subject, which is over there and we can talk about later, I talk about the paradox of pornography. And by the paradox of pornography, I mean two trends that are uncontroversial in the last, let's say the last 25 years, the period of time I've been studying this. There are two trends in contemporary pornography that no one would contest, whether you're a supporter of pornography or a critic. One of those trends is that pornography has become more mainstream than ever. For those of us old enough to remember this trajectory, it's obvious, but even those who are younger can recognize that pornography is ubiquitous, yes? If I asked you all to identify a pornographic image, how long would it take? About as long as it would take you to pull out your phone or turn on your laptop and do a quick search. Pornography is everywhere. Pornography has become more mainstream, we can say more normalized than ever before. And by normalized, I don't mean that everybody thinks it's normal and healthy and good, but that the presence of pornography in mainstream culture is now, for the most part, not really critiqued. And again, another way to say this is not only has pornography, that is graphic sexually explicit material, become more mainstream, but what we think of as mainstream pop culture, Hollywood movies, television, whatever, has become more pornographic. In fact, images that we would have once called pornography are now routine on television. Right? That there's a kind of normalizing of the whole pornographic imagination in some sense. That's one trend that's undeniable in the last 25 years. Porn has become more accepted in contemporary America. The other trend that's also undeniable is that in that same period, pornography has become more overtly cruel and degrading to women and more overtly racist. In this same 25 years, the actual content of this category we're calling porn, graphic sexually explicit material, has become more overtly cruel and degrading to women and more overtly racist. We can explore what that means, but take it for now that is an accurate assessment of the industry. And again, whether you're a pornography critic or supporter, nobody would really contest that. The paradox then is quite clear. In a civilized society, how can you have a mass media genre that is more mainstream, more normalized, more accepted than ever, precisely at the time that it's become more overtly cruel and degrading and more racist? Those would seem to be trends that would not go together in a civilized society. But in fact, both of those trends are undeniable in the last 25 years. So that gives you a sense of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about pornography. Okay? Again, we can, in the discussion period, revisit any of the claims I've just made, but I think you'll find, if you do just a little bit of research, that those are not, again, contentious claims. Everything I've said so far is pretty straightforward. All right. Let's move in then to this question, is pornography immoral? To answer that question, I'm going to have to talk not just about morality or ethics or moral theory, but also about politics and political theory. So we're going to answer the question by looking at both political and moral questions. So let me start by explaining what I mean by those terms, political and moral. By political, I don't mean the narrow conception of politics that tends to dominate in the culture. Are you a Republican or are you a Democrat? Who'd you vote for in the elections? You know, in this culture, discussion of politics tends to focus us on the electoral arena, people running for office, and the two conventional parties that tend to put up those candidates. I mean political in the broader sense, about the distribution of power. In any society, you know, wherever two or more are gathered, there is politics, yes? You cannot be in any kind of human group without some distribution of power, whether it's informal in a group of friends or formal in a large political unit like a nation state. There's always a political dimension to our lives, always a way in which decisions are made. And decisions are made either in ways that distribute power or ways that concentrate power. So there's always a political question, I think, to these discussions. I don't think you can do moral theory without political theory. I don't think you can talk about right and wrong without talking about power. So we're going to talk about the question, is pornography immoral, with a political lens as well. Second, when I talk about moral, I don't want it to be confused with what we might call mores. That is, what we would consider perhaps subjective judgments about how people should behave in a very sort of specified way. A lot of people have an experience of being told that they're immoral, and what that really means is you're not conforming to my subjective conception of how the world should work. So we want to talk about politics and the political in the more expansive way, about how power is distributed. And we want to talk about moral in a more expansive way too. And I would describe morality at the level I'm discussing it as an attempt to answer a very simple question. What does it mean to be human in the modern context? What does it mean to be human, fully human? Right, that's what I mean when I talk about morality. Not making sure we draw lines and create, you know, lanes in which you must stay or you are immoral. And the reason I say that is so many of us have had experience of being told we are immoral, and it usually does come with this, the wagging finger, you know. Young lady, young man, that is immoral. And that kind of judgment is often imposed on us, not because we've struggled together to answer the question, what does it mean to be human, but because someone with power has defined for us what is and is not acceptable. Okay. So those are the terms I want to set for the discussion tonight. All right. I want to start with what might seem like some trivial, maybe even self-evident claims, but I think because there's so much discussion, debate, and often misunderstanding about how we talk about sex and gender, it's important to deal with terms. So bear with me as I go through what may seem like very simplistic kinds of statements. Now, I want to say that it's kind of, again, not controversial to claim that there are biological differences between male and female humans that are not trivial. That's kind of obvious, yes? Different reproductive systems, different hormones, that's all I mean. There are differences between male human beings and female human beings that are not trivial, in the sense that there are trivial differences. Right? We could take this room and divide people into the group with the big ears and the group with the small ears. That's a real difference, yes? Ear size. Does anybody think ear size is important to understanding your identity? No. Okay, so when I say that the differences between the category biologically male and biologically female are not trivial, I mean that they are of a nature that means we can't ignore them, in the way that we can ignore some other kinds of differences that you can see are real, for instance, skin color. Right? There's different complexions in the room, and that has social meaning, but we know that biologically that has no meaning. It's trivial difference. It's made real only by social systems. But in terms of sex, there are real differences between male and female. Okay. Now, it's not hard to imagine that the differences between male and female in reproductive system, hormones, etc., could give rise to differences in the realm of the moral, the intellectual, the psychological. Again, this may seem like you can't understand why I'm going through this, but bear with me. It's possible that the differences between male and female do mean something. There are differences that make a difference in our moral, our intellectual, or our psychological makeup. In other words, we may be able to look at men and women and see that those differences mean something. But I want to assert, and here where it might be controversial, that we routinely overestimate the moral, intellectual, and psychological differences that come from the basic biological differences. That because we live in patriarchy, where we have obsessed with gender and the claims that especially men make to special status by virtue of their sex, that we probably routinely overestimate how much those biological differences mean in the realm of moral, intellectual, and psychological differences. Right? So you've heard, I don't know if this is still a book anybody's aware of, but there's a book that was a popular bestseller in the kind of pop psychology realm called Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. You know that book? Does that title resonate? So the argument from this guy is that men and women are essentially from different planets. In other words, he's taking the physical differences and saying they mean everything. Well, as we know, men aren't from Mars, women aren't. We're all from Earth, and we're all the same in some very basic ways. So I want to counsel against overestimating the differences that might arise, the differences in moral, intellectual, and psychological makeup that might arise from those basic differences. Why am I haranguing on this? Because if that's true, then the differences that we're talking about between male and female humans have no political significance. That is, they should say nothing about how men and women are situated in society. Right? The differences we don't really know how to make sense of completely, but if you accept this position, then we should be moving toward sex equality. That on all of the meaningful ways we structure society, who is a political agent, for instance? Men and women should be equal. We've settled that one. Women get to vote, okay? Can women hold certain kinds of positions? You know, all of these questions that have for much of the history of patriarchy not been settled at all, at some level are settled, and that sex equality is the goal. That given the kind of animals we are, the kind of bodies we have, and the kind of moral, intellectual, and psychological profiles we have, there is no reason to question whether or not sex equality is the appropriate political arrangement. Now, if somebody wants to argue that out, we can do that during discussion, but I don't think that's terribly controversial either. And that means that impediments to sex equality, especially those impediments that arise because of patriarchal histories and traditions, need to be removed. So I'm going to suggest that removing impediments to sex equality in patriarchal societies is a political imperative. It's a very important thing that we do that. Okay. Now, patriarchy, let's go back to this because I've been throwing this word around and I've noticed not everybody smiles when I say it. So let's see what we are talking about. Let's go in. So what is patriarchy? Again, patriarchy is a system based on male dominance. It's the assertion that males and females were either created or evolved, depending on whether you want to take a theological or a secular position on this, that males and females were created or evolved for fundamentally different purposes. That's the core of patriarchy, the assertion that there is this very significant difference. It can be grounded in God, it can be grounded in evolution, but all of those patriarchal arguments assert that these differences are essentially immutable, that in fact male and female are in these very different positions. And there's a history to patriarchy. It's not a permanent condition in human history. Human beings like us, the modern human, have been on the planet about 200,000 years. And patriarchy, a system defined as I'm defining it, is only, depending on how you look at it, 6, 7, 8,000 years old. So patriarchy is a rather recent innovation in human history. Right? Now, patriarchy takes lots of different forms. I would argue that, for instance, both Saudi Arabia and the United States of America are patriarchal societies, although you can see that the social systems and the cultural norms are quite different. But both, I would argue, are patriarchal. We have to realize that in a diverse world today, with many, many different types of cultures, patriarchy is going to take very, very different forms. But at the core of patriarchy is a concern for controlling women's sexuality. And that can take different forms as well. In the more conservative traditional form, that is about controlling women's sexuality in very, very rigid ways, where only specific men have access to women's sexuality under very specific terms. That's patriarchy. I would argue that the conditions under which we live in the United States today, where women are still compelled to be sexually available to men, but in far more expansive ways, is still patriarchal. So I'm going to make the argument that, in a sense, Saudi Arabia and the United States are flip sides of the same patriarchal coin. Different ways of understanding women's sexuality and how it can be made accessible to men, but a focus on the fact that that sexuality must be made available to men under the terms that men set. That's what I think defines sexuality. Here we're going to focus on one aspect of that, what I'm going to call the sexual exploitation industries: pornography, prostitution, and stripping. Those are what I routinely refer to as the sexual exploitation industries, ways in which men routinely buy and sell women's bodies for sexual pleasure. Okay? Now, obviously, pornography, prostitution, stripping can also take place in a gay male context, where it's not men buying women's bodies, but the model is imported from heterosexuality and patriarchy. But the overwhelming majority of prostitution, pornography, and stripping is men buying and selling women's bodies for sexual pleasure, what we're going to call these sexual exploitation industries. Okay. I'm going to assert that any system in which one group of people can buy and sell the bodies of another group of people inherently undermines the claim to equality by that one group. That if you're in a system where one group, in this case men, can buy and sell women's bodies, right, that is going to undermine sex equality. That it's hard for someone who is then rendered as object. Because remember, what do you buy and sell? You buy and sell things. You don't buy and sell people. That's why in slavery, for instance, slaves had to be reduced to something subhuman. Because we don't buy and sell people. We buy and sell things. And so if you are buying and selling a woman's body, you are reducing that subject, in philosophical terms, to an object. You are saying this person is not fully human, and therefore she can be bought and sold. And any system in which you can routinely buy and sell someone means you have reduced that person from subject to object, and that, I think, is quite clearly an impediment to sex equality. This political arrangement where we want everybody to have equal status in the political life of the culture. I don't think you can make democracy work without sex equality. And since we all love democracy because we're here in the US, right? And I mean, I guess we could take a moment and say, does anybody want to argue for an alternative political arrangement? Do we have any current supporters of traditional fascism in the room? If so, identify yourself and come make your pitch for, no, okay. So the assumptions we all make about the appropriate way to organize a political unit, I'm suggesting means we must have a commitment to sex equality, and in that we must then try to be removing the impediments to sex equality, one of which is the normalizing of the sexual exploitation industries. So what I'm arguing is that from a political point of view, looking at how power is distributed and who has access to the system by which those decisions are made, we must reject pornography. It's in that sense immoral because it undermines the full functioning status of women in a political context. If equality is a political value, it's because there's an underlying moral claim that everybody has a right to it. And so every political claim, in some sense, imports a moral claim with it. So I want to argue that pornography is immoral in a very different kind of way. It's immoral because it undermines women's ability to achieve in a society. It undermines our progress toward sex equality. I'm looking for some affirmation that even if you don't agree, you understood the argument I just constructed. Okay, thank you. All right. So that's one part of the argument I want to make about the moral status of pornography. Now notice how this argument did not sound like a Jesus-preaching evangelical pastor talking about, this is, when we think about moral arguments in this realm around sexuality, we tend to think of people wagging the finger, yes? Talking about sin. We can talk about sin. I know about sin. Every good evangelical pastor always confesses to his brush with sin. I'm no different than you. I've been down in the gutter with you, brothers and sisters. I know what sin is like. I've been gambling, I've been whoring, I've been drinking. Okay. Not going to go there. That is not the moral argument I'm making. And I poke fun a bit because it's easy to, and I'm out of Texas, and whenever I'm out of Texas, I take every opportunity possible to poke fun at anything remotely Texan. But I don't want to go down that road, and I want to mark that the moral argument I just made didn't sound a lot like the moral argument we're used to hearing about these matters around sex. Okay. That's a political analysis, and the radical feminist critique of pornography that I've been referencing, which emerged out of the larger feminist movement, especially the feminist movement concerned with men's violence against women, that argument I'm just talking about always articulated its principles in political terms. In large part, I think, because it didn't want to be conflated with that more traditional conservative, often religious argument. The radical feminists who pioneered this critique didn't want to be, told they were just giving us a version of some moralistic, right-wing evangelical argument. So they made it very clear that this was political in nature, and that the underlying principles were about sex equality. And I think that argument was compelling when it was first made in the late 1970s. I think it's even more compelling today. But there is another level at which I think we need to talk about moral discussions in this term. And that is, I always say, caught up in what I think is one of the most important questions that we so rarely talk about. And the question is very simple. What is sex for? Okay. Now, before you start thinking, oh my God, he moved to Texas, and apparently he forgot basic biology. No, when I say what is sex for, I don't mean that I don't understand the mechanics of sex and how it works and all of that, right? But that there is a deeper level at which we have to ask and try to answer, probably not definitively answer, but struggle with that question. The question, what is sex for, strikes me, is a fundamentally moral question. Again, not moral in the sense that I am about to tell you how you can and cannot behave sexually, but the recognition that sex is a powerful force in human life. Right? For those of you, I'm looking out, I don't know what your own personal position is. Some of you are celibate, some of you are sexually active, some of you are gay, some of you are straight, some of you are confused, that's me. I've always been confused about all these things. Right? So I'm not making assumptions about anybody in the room tonight, but I do know that sex is a powerful force in human life. And it's a force that we don't fully understand. I said this in one of the classes today. I think of sex essentially as mystery. I'm going to digress briefly here. But when I say sex is mystery, I don't mean, again, I don't understand the mechanics of it. I mean that if we were to step back and think about our own lives and think about all of the things that we have done in our life out of a very powerful sense of sexual desire that in retrospect probably were ill-advised. You know what I'm saying? I saw one really big smile. I'm not going to point at who that was. But think about things you've done, things you've said to other people, offers you've made to other people, offers you have accepted from other people, things you've done with your body that were driven out of desire, sexual desire, that in retrospect, whether it was the next morning or 5 years later, or in my case, 30 years later perhaps, that you think to yourself, wow, that was really self-destructive. That was not in my own self-interest. Is there anybody in the room who's ever, you're a tough crowd. You don't give away much with your facial expressions. Is there anyone, you don't have to tell me what it was, but is there anyone who can reflect on their own life briefly and say, yes, there have been things I've done out of sexual desire that were perhaps ill-advised, and I don't know exactly why I did that? Okay, thank you. The rest of you are lying. I don't believe you. All right. So where sex has, whatever your conception of what is or is not appropriate sexually, sex is a very powerful force in human existence. And it's important to thinking through this question of what does it mean to be human? Subset, what is sex for? What role does it play in our lives? Now again, I want to make it clear, when I go down this path to ask about moral questions about sexuality, trying to answer or at least struggle with this question, what is sex for? I'm not suggesting there is an arbitrary, rigid conception of what is and isn't appropriate sexually that I can impose on you or want to impose on you. It's more about the struggle to deal with the mystery than anything else. Okay? Here's another way to formulate the question a little more precisely. What conception of sexual behavior is consistent with a decent, sustainable human community? What is sex for can be rearticulated in this question. What conception of sexual behavior is consistent with a decent, sustainable human community? That seems to me to be a really important question, especially because these days human communities don't seem to me to be fundamentally decent or sustainable. I look around at the world and I get nervous about the way we have built contemporary culture. It often looks very indecent to me. It often looks to be not trying to achieve, by decency I mean a sense in which all people are connected, a sense of solidarity, a capacity for empathy, an understanding of the central role of compassion and love. I look around and I don't always see that in contemporary America. I also don't see a very sustainable culture, a culture that can go on like this indefinitely. It seems to me that we are in deep trouble on both those counts. All right, so how would we answer that question? What conception of sexual behavior is consistent with a decent, sustainable human community? Again, I want to make it clear, I'm going to say this over and over again, I'm not going to end this discussion with a list of rules for you to follow. I don't think that would be productive. But I do think we can start to ask questions. For instance, for adult sexual behavior, is it kind of the way we're built to seek out pair-bonded relationships? Now, there's a lot of people would say we are fundamentally a pair-bonding species. Other species of animals are also pair-bonded. You know, is that sort of the way to establish a sustainable human community, to establish pair bonds in which we are sexually intimate with each other, especially as adults? That seems like something worth discussing. I don't know that that's the single answer, but it's the kind of thing we have to talk about. Notice I said adult pair bonding relationships. Maybe it's the case that when we are younger and coming into an awareness of our own bodies as sexual bodies, there's a period of exploration that need not be attached to these pair bond? You know, there's all sorts of ways to ask and struggle with that question. Maybe the sexual norms for young people should be different than the sexual norms for adults. We also have to recognize there's a lot of individual variation in the human species. You ever notice that? You know, this is the sort of, again, to digress briefly, just the reality of being human. We are all essentially the same. Every one of the 7 billion people on this planet is essentially indistinguishable from one another. Somebody came from another planet and looked at us, what would they see? They would see 7 billion biological entities that look pretty much the same. Right? That's true. We are fundamentally indistinguishable from each other. And we are all a very precious snowflake. Right? We are all, and that's true too. This is one of those basic things. We are all uniquely individual and we are all basically the same. But that uniquely individual part is not trivial, that there is a lot of individual variation in the human species. And so whatever claim we make about what is sex for, about what conception of human sexuality is consistent with that decent, sustainable society, it seems to me we should allow for a lot of individual variation and recognize that no two people are exactly the same. But I think this awareness of a need for space for exploration should also recognize that whatever the boundaries of that exploration are, they have to be consistent over the long term with building that decent, sustainable human community. All right. Those seem to me to be moral claims that don't have to set us at each other's throats depending on our theological background or, cultural training or other things. Those are reasonable questions. As long as I'm not up here telling you what the answer to those questions are, it seems to me that that is acceptable. Now, from my point of view, pornography is immoral, again, not in the finger-wagging sense, but in this broader moral sense, because I don't see how pornography is consistent with building a decent, sustainable human community. I don't see how pornography and the sexual exploitation industries more generally are consistent with building a decent, sustainable human community in the sense of sexual relationships. This is a different argument than the argument about sex equality. I've already argued that pornography is immoral because it is an impediment to achieving sex equality. This is a different realm we're in, talking about what conception of our own sexual being do we need to build that decent, sustainable human community. And I don't see how the sexual exploitation industries are consistent with building that community. I've looked at it from lots of different angles, and I have yet to come across a powerful argument that this kind of sexual exploitation industry is consistent with that. All right? So in this sense, pornography is immoral because it undermines our ability to create the relationships that we need to build that decent, sustainable human community. So I'm making two arguments about pornography and its moral status, one based in a set of political assertions that have an underlying moral claim built into them, inevitably, right? Not just me imposing that moral claim, but because political conversations like that are inherently moral as well. And the other wrestling with this moral question at a different level. Even in a non-patriarchal, egalitarian society, we would have to come to some understanding about what sex is for. And that conversation should not threaten us, that we should be willing to engage in that conversation. All right, one last point, and then we'll open it up to conversation. I'm often, when I make arguments like this, people often challenge me, whether male or female, often women, with this question: can't there be a feminist pornography that helps open up this discussion, right? So I'm arguing for this kind of conversation about how to set sexual norms, what kind of moral claims about sex we want to make. And I've had people say, well, can't pornography, graphic, sexually explicit material that breaks out of the patriarchal mode, that is feminist in some sense of trying to achieve a more egalitarian conception of sex, can't that be part of this conversation that I claim I want to have? Because after all, art is often part of our conversations about moral and political subjects, yes? I shouldn't have to make that claim too long in a Catholic college. You ever looked around at any Catholic institution? You got a lot of art here, people. Right? Art is central to the Catholic experience and to religious experiences in many, many traditions. Now, why is that? Well, again, I'm going to digress. I said that sex is essentially mystery. And traditionally, when human beings bump up against things that are mysterious to us, what is one thing that we do? We make art. Because art helps us go beyond our rational, analytical faculties. Right? Rationality and analysis only take you so far in life. And so when we bump up against the limits of that, we tend to create. We use our creative capacities to write poetry and write songs and paint pictures and do all sorts of things. And I think that's healthy. I want to make it very clear in case anybody was worried. I'm for art. Art's a good thing. Art's an especially good thing because it helps us explore those things that we can't get at in a more linear fashion. My wife happens to be a songwriter, so I'm a big fan of art. And I'm especially a big fan of people buying her art so that she can make enough money so I can retire early, but that's another story. All right. So there's also, if you haven't noticed, a lot of art about God. Why? Because God, the concept of God and the divine, is also essentially mystery to us. We struggle not to define God. If anybody wants to offer a definition of God, I'd be happy to hear it. I've never heard anybody give me a good definition of God because that's not the point. The point of conversations about God is to explore. Okay? So I want to make it clear that I'm all for art, and I think art's very useful in exploring the mystery of life. And so when people say, well, couldn't there be a sexually explicit art? Right? Not the crude commercial pornography we were talking about, not pornography in a patriarchal context, but a feminist-inspired, egalitarian art that just happens to be sexually explicit. Here, I think there's another set of questions that are very important. This is kind of a digression from the two main arguments, but one that I think is really important, especially for the generation coming up in a completely wired, hyper-mediated world. The world in which some of you are right now looking at your phones because I'm so boring you couldn't stand another minute without seeing if you were texted by a friend who's going to meet you after the talk. Yes? How many currently engaged in that activity? Don't raise your hands. I don't want to know because it'll be more than it, well, it'll make me feel bad. And I have self-esteem issues and I don't want you to make it worse. Okay. We live in this hyper-mediated, high-technology society in which I think we should be asking ourselves, are we too quick to want to mediate everything? Are there realms of life that don't need to be mediated? Are there certain kinds of interaction between human beings which actually work out better without one of these? I have one of these too. Right? And I will check my email after the thing, and I will see if anybody texted me. Oh, but is there a realm of life in which mediation is a barrier to that capacity to explore ourselves? Right? And especially is intimate sexual behavior an area which is especially immune to mediation. What I mean by that is are there areas of our lives that in some sense were meant to be private, that were not meant to be mediated and shared with the world? And by private, I want to be careful because those of you who've studied feminist philosophy and political theory know that this whole public-private distinction, I'm going to now digress from my digression a bit, that whole public-private distinction is very tricky. Because in patriarchy, in male-dominated societies, men have often claimed the private sphere is immune from critique. You know, what happens in my house is my business. You know, that's a typical patriarchal statement. In other words, you try and create a private space in which you are immune from criticism. And I don't mean private in that sense. That's a very toxic and unhealthy conception of the private, a space walled off from public concern. Right? But are there parts of our lives that are in fact private, and is the intimate and the sexual one of those spaces that works better when it remains private? And that the mediation, especially in this hyper-mediated culture, the mediation of that, and by mediation I just mean, you know, using some high technology to take images and sound and things and put them in the public realm. Is sex something best left unmediated? Now, that's a question that I have an answer for in my own life. And the answer is yes, sex is best left unmediated. But I also recognize that that is a question in which that individual variation may well be really important. And it may be that the experience of younger people who grew up in a hypermediated world is so profoundly different than mine that I don't just get it. Maybe I don't get it, okay? There's a lot of stuff old people don't get. Have you ever noticed that? And I am in the category at the age of 54 of old, right, relative to you all. So I don't want to make a definitive statement about that, but I do think it's something worth thinking about, right? That the claim I made that pornography is immoral because of the commitment to sex equality, I'm pretty clear about that, and I'll argue that one as long as you want to stay here and argue it. The argument that pornography is immoral because in that struggle to understand what makes us human and how we can create decent, sustainable human communities, pornography is inconsistent with it. That one I'm pretty strongly committed to as well. But this question about mediation, I understand is of a different nature. But I do think it's a very important question, not just in the realm of sex, but in the realm of our entire existence. Are we, in fact, hyper-mediating ourselves into some space that is not healthy in all sorts of different ways? Okay. Now, last point. I want to reassert this over and over again so nobody leaves misunderstanding. To make moral claims about pornography is not to say that I think there is a destination to this discussion which will allow me or anyone else to dictate to you in a rigid and authoritarian fashion how you must behave sexually. That is not the intention of this. The intention of this is to open up a question that I'm going to argue, and this is where I'll conclude, that this culture is terrified of. And this culture is terrified of the question of sex. On the surface, that may seem just a little bit counterintuitive because turn on the television, pop up the internet. This culture is awash in conversation about sex, in images about sex. We are flooded with sex. But in a way, the 25 years I've spent working on this question has taught me that this culture is in fact terrified of an open and honest conversation about sex that talks about and takes seriously the political and talks about and takes seriously the moral. And so I want to sort of make visible those questions, even though I realize that the questions, the terms I'm using, are not fashionable. I'm a distinctly unfashionable person. Luckily, I was born and raised in North Dakota, so I'm used to being unfashionable. North Dakota is not the center of fashion in this world. But unfashionable though they may be, as definitively unhip as I am, I still, yeah, it's okay, you can laugh. I know, I have a 21-year-old son, and anytime I might have illusions about being hip, he's right there to correct me. So I don't mind striking this sort of unhip, unsophisticated, call it what you want, pose, because I think these are crucial questions. Crucial questions not just for how we understand ourselves sexually, but how we understand ourselves in a lot of different ways. Because, as I said, that decent, sustainable culture we're trying to create is, to me, elusive these days. And I think we have to start, restart, and constantly push these kinds of questions. And then my last comment, just, you'll notice that I introduced myself by saying I'm a radical feminist and a Christian, and then didn't say much about the Christianity part. I cited no Bible verses. I referenced no theologians. That's partly because I'm not a scholar in that realm. I'm not a theologian, and I'm not conversant in that. But it's also because I think every question I just asked was a fundamentally Christian question. That the space between the secular and the theological that we're so obsessed with maintaining in this culture is in fact largely illusion. What I found is that the questions I took up in the political realm that I was introduced through radical feminism, and the questions I've been taking up since returning to church and embracing a Christian identity, right, are in fact the same questions, and that we need both of those traditions. To me, it's not either or. And some of my colleagues in radical feminism are a little suspect these days about why is this guy going back to church? the Christians, after all, are the ones that have been haranguing us, right? In Christian circles, there's a lot of skepticism about who's this guy. He says he's a Christian, but he's got all this radical feminist stuff going on. And I just want to suggest that those two are not in opposition. But understanding the tradition and the roots of those traditions means that we can bring those together. And if we don't bring those together, I think that decent, sustainable human community is going to be out of reach. So with that, I think, agree or disagree, I put out some assertions that we can react to. I just wanted to note one thing, that there is another talk happening at 8 p.m., correct? By a visiting theologian, speaking about the Jewish tradition, as I remember from seeing the poster. And I won't be offended if anybody had their fill of me and wants to slip out. It's about 5 minutes to 8 right now, and go over to that other talk. I personally want to slip out and go over to that other talk, but Shane said I can't, that I have to stay. So my intention is to stay as long as you all want to talk, but I certainly would understand those who want to leave. That also provides a convenient excuse for anybody who has no intention of going to the other talk, but is sick of me, to make it look like you're really smart and you're going to the other talk. But with that, I'm going to open it up. I was told that we're going to try and get the questions on camera. There's a video camera in the back, which means speaking from a microphone. So if people who do want to make a comment, ask a question, or challenge anything I said, and that third category is very important. Challenges are not only accepted, but are welcome. I've been talking about things like this for a long time, and I'm used to being told I'm crazy, and don't take it personally. So challenges, comments, questions, or requests for clarification, the floor is open. Please come up to the mic and add to the conversation. Of course, when nobody does that, I have to fill, and it's really awkward to try in 7 different ways invite people up to the microphone. There you go.
Okay, so I understood what you said about politically and about sustaining the human community. What I didn't understand was how you said that our culture is afraid of sex.
How is our culture afraid of sex? Okay, that's a good question, because on the surface it appears that we are almost obsessed with sex.
Yeah.
But sex, the way in which we're comfortable with sex is, I think, a very superficial understanding of sex. You know, like, for instance, I noticed you're looking really hot tonight, baby. Okay, that was a joke. That was a demonstration. I didn't mean that. I mean, I'm not making a comment on anything. I just mean that the world is full of things like that, yeah? Okay, is that a meaningful conversation about sex? I mean, that's the level at which sex talk is commonplace, right? But that doesn't help us understand these really difficult questions about what sex means, what's it for, why do we feel so compelled, you know, what's the connection between sex and intimacy, sex and love, all those kinds of things I don't think we talk about, at least not in very sensible terms.
Our culture isn't afraid of sex itself, it's afraid of the feeling of intimacy and love, so it's afraid of the feelings that you can have when you have sex because of love.
I think that's part of it, but also not only about the fear of attaching sex to intimacy, affection, love, whatever it might be, but the even deeper discussion about how are we going to understand our bodies? What are we going to do with things like gay and lesbian sexuality? What are we going to do when somebody who's straight feels a homoerotic connection to a close? All of these things that really are the deeper mysteries, I think we don't talk about very much at all. And those are the conversations I think we really need to have. That we become, in a sense, this is a critique I would make of liberal and even radical trends in recent culture, that we've turned sex into a discussion of nothing more important than the Super Bowl. Right? That's what I mean. So it's not that we're afraid of sex, we're afraid of a certain level of conversation about what sex really means. We're still stuck to some degree in this patriarchal mindset that's now been tempered with this liberal explosion of sex talk, sex images. but we've never come to understand what it really means. We've gone from a repressive tradition to an expansive commodification without the conversation about what any of this means. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Okay. Thank
That
you.
makes sense. Yeah. Okay. No, you can come up. It's good. You can line up behind, and then there's that awkward silence is minimized.
All right, I'm going to just argue basically with your main theme that pornography is completely antithetical to a sustainable community. I don't feel like you've given us any evidence to support that pornography harms relationships or communities.
Okay.
So, and you're going to say it's the domination subordination theme that I established within pornography, but we've all grown up internalizing domination and subordination as erotic, as sexy. So if that's how we've been internalized and that's what's sexy,
Yes.
that's kind of where I'm going.
Okay. So that's a very good point. So in response to some of the claims I made, there are some folks, especially the Freudians and related types, who will say, listen, sex is inevitably about a struggle for power. There's a whole rap about that. I don't think that's in fact the case. I think that's a certain construction of sex that doesn't square with my experience and understanding. I don't believe that sex is invariably about struggles for power and domination. I think that's what, as you maybe were hinting, that's what it's become in this particular culture, especially in patriarchal cultures. But this conversation I'm having, I want us to have, is about how can we think beyond that. Okay. Now, I've given you no evidence that pornography is destructive. That's in part because the conversation about that is really quite brutal. And we could have that conversation. I can tell you about my own research and the work of others that have looked at, number one, what are the pornographic images actually saying? And number two, what effect do they have on the women who are used in the production of them? And what effect do they have on people in the real world? Women in relationships or strangers who encounter men who are using, there's all those kinds of questions. And I think the evidence there is that the pornographic experiment, let's say, of the last half century has had overwhelmingly disastrous consequences. That there is real harm, both physical and psychological, that emerges from the pornifying of the culture. Real harm to the women who are used in the production of pornography. Remember I said that pornography, and again, I was trying to just avoid some of the more graphic and really kind of brutal descriptions. But I said that pornography is more overtly cruel and degrading to women than ever before. What that translates into is sexual scenes in pornography in which a woman is penetrated by 5 guys over the course of an hour. All right? So what does that mean physically and psychologically to that woman? Okay? What does it mean when men's sexual imagination, often from a very early age, if I were to poll the men in the room, I'm not going to do this, don't worry, and ask, how old were you when you first saw a graphic sexually explicit image? My guess is that with today's college-age students, the average age would probably be, I'm guessing, somewhere in the 10 to 12 range, which means that before you even knew what sex was, in a sense, your sexual imagination was being conditioned to images of women being humiliated, degraded, or even the targets of violence. So what does that do to the sexual imagination of the ordinary, quote-unquote, American heterosexual male who at some point will move into an actual physical sexual relationship with someone? Well, there we do have some evidence from self-reports, both men, especially younger men who've talked to me and others, about what the effect of that is, and the deeply conflicted nature of being very attracted to the quick sexual charge of pornography. And I mean, every guy in the room who's ever used pornography knows that pornography works, yes? I mean, as one man in the porn industry said, it's good, it's good. It gets you up, it gets you off quickly, you move on, I mean, what happens when that allure of porn over and over again conditions your own sexual imagination to the degradation of women? And what happens then when you move into sexual, well, Men report about the struggles they have with that. Women report about how they have male partners who become emotionally distant and unable to connect because their sexual imagination is so wrapped up in porn. Or the flip side, women reporting that men come into a relationship expecting porn sex, that is, sexual acts that are not common in everyday life, but are common in porn, including things like multiple penetrations and all sorts of things. So those are the real world. So the trajectory of the porn world that we live in, I think, has been overwhelmingly destructive. It doesn't mean that there aren't people who don't incorporate porn into a healthy sex life. I mean, you know, there's a lot of, again, individual variation in the species. But I think the trends and the data is quite clear about what this has meant. And so that's why I say I think pornography is inconsistent with a decent, sustainable human community. I see no evidence that it can be made to work that way. Yeah. Go ahead.
In talking about a sustainable community, I guess one thing that came to my mind, I think we live in a community in which like independence and individuality is desired.
Yeah.
But thinking about this, like in a spectrum ranging from pornography and the industry you talk about compared to like healthy sexual relationships, I'm curious where you would put the recent trend like hooking up on that, like because you talked about like having connections in sex and striving for that, like instead of putting that. So I'm just curious where you would put that on the spectrum.
I was tempted to just make a joke, but after that attempted a joke about being hot, I'm just going to play it very safe from now on. Okay, so the hookup culture, you've all heard this term, yes? A move from, especially on campuses, a campus culture where if it's in a heterosexual context, men and women or in same-sex couples move toward, developing a relationship, becoming intimate after that relationship has developed, and an assumption there might be continuing contact, to a culture where sex is treated, essentially like a handshake. Hey, how you doing? Good. Let's have sex. End of thing. See you tomorrow. Whatever. All right. To me, and this is. To me, you can't build healthy, sustainable cultures on that either. Again, I wanted to point out that the norms for sexual exploration when we're young may well be different and should be different than the norms when we move into, adult life. That part of the experience of being young is that trying things out. And that might mean that instead of saying the first person you have sex with you have to marry and commit your entire life to, there should be a period where young people can move in and out of relationships. That doesn't mean that moving in and out of relationships is best achieved by moving in and out of different relationships quickly with no connection, because I don't think we learn anything about ourselves. This is, again, now we're in the realm of just kind of an assertion about what I believe to be true. I don't think we learn much about ourselves, our bodies, our emotional life in that hookup culture, right? That exploring your body, exploring your own psychological connection to other people is best done over some amount of time. That the hookup culture is a culture of instant gratification. And in most things, in my experience, instant gratification, whatever the short-term allure of it, has not been conducive in my life to building and contributing to that better culture. That's just the way it seems to me. It might be one of those things where I'm an old guy and I don't get it. But I've seen no evidence presented to me either from research or from the reports of young people that this hookup culture is making you all happier, more self-aware, more stable. I see no evidence of that. If I'm wrong, but it doesn't occur to me that's what's happening.
I have a question about slut shaming. I don't know if you've heard about that.
Yeah.
It's like shaming the slut, and in relation to your sustainable and decent culture.
Yeah.
So.
This whole concept of slut shaming, I must confess I have a kind of tense relationship with. The term slut, which you're all familiar with, meaning a woman who is sexually promiscuous, right, has been used to punish women who either are in fact, engaged in sex with multiple partners out of a choice of their own, or to shame women who aren't but are being labeled that way. I mean, the term gets used against women in general. The term is a term to discipline women and try and get you to conform to male expectations. Right? It's not used in any consistent or principled way. It's used as a weapon. And I don't like the word. Right? And so when young women sort of take up that term and say, and I'm not saying that's the way you're using it, but I've heard young women say, yeah, I'm a slut and I'm proud of it. That doesn't resonate for me as a useful way to try and claim some space and autonomy for yourself. So should women be shamed for their sexual choices? No. In general, I don't think anybody should be shamed for their sexual choices. I think we should be held accountable when we make sexual choices that hurt others. And this is especially important for men, of course, who are often socialized to ignore the consequences of their sexual choices for others. So I think we should have a system where we're accountable to each other, where we keep each other together, because it's hard to do it on your own. But the term slut to me is irreducibly patriarchal and can't be rescued for me. I don't see how to make sense of it. So I don't think women should be shamed, but I also would challenge, especially the younger women who tend to adopt that term, to ask, what are you really doing? Is this, in fact, a vehicle for liberation, or is this simply playing into the hands of a patriarchal understanding? And again, that's one of those things where I'm really reluctant to say, here's the answer and you should follow my lead. There's a lot in this world that I'm sure about, as I said, but there are a lot of things I'm still trying to figure out myself. So this came up first when there were the slut walks. Remember that? If you don't know the history of this, there was an unfortunate incident in, I think it was Toronto, where a police officer publicly said that a woman who had been raped was somehow partially responsible, maybe completely responsible because of the way she looked. And that old patriarchal claim that if you're raped, it's your fault because you somehow provoked a man. Right? That's the worst kind of patriarchal defense of male violence. This police officer said it, and in the context of it, he used the word slut, if you weren't such a slut or whatever. So women decided to have slut walks, where they said, you know, you can't shame us. And as a result of that, you had slut walks, which were supposed to be women's empowerment events, where women were dressed up in the most stereotypical female dress, which women are often forced to wear to please men. It gets so I get frustrated because I don't see how that's advancing the cause. But I might be missing something. So I've missed things before. Won't be the first time I was wrong. But I'm hesitant about it, that's all. All right. There's no need to prolong this. If there's no rush to the microphone, why don't we make this the last comment, and then I'm happy to stay around and talk informally. Over on the table, there are copies of the book I wrote about porn and some other things I've written about, and we can retire to that side of the room and just have an informal conversation. So you get the last question, if not the last word. We'll see.
I'm an international student, and or as a foreign, I happen to be Japanese, but I picked up you touched a little about porn and race, and it's like I want little elaboration on that. I happened to be told like 1 week or 2 weeks ago, that this from one SJU student that he finds Japanese female more freaky than like girls or something. And so that kind of got me here today, and I just want a little more elaboration on this, that.
Yeah, so I said that porn was more explicitly racist than ever before, which seems a little strange because in general, one of the few places we've made progress in contemporary American media is on the question of race. Movies, television are less racist today than they were when I was a kid. Right? Some of the more overt racist stereotypes you used to see routinely in mainstream media when I was young are pretty much gone today. I'm not saying that Hollywood movies or television are now free of any racial bias. There are a lot of subtle, I think, racist themes in some of that mainstream media. But when I say porn is more racist than ever, I don't mean in some subtle way. I mean the use of overt racist stereotypes, especially stereotypes around the black male as a sexually dangerous character, stereotypes around black women as more animalistic, stereotypes around Latinas as kind of hot and racy, stereotypes around Asian women in this context of the kind of the geisha girl, the demure Asian woman who will do anything, including really freaky things, because she lives to please men, especially Western men. All of these are just racist stereotypes that have been circulating in contemporary culture for a long, long time, and for some reason kind of get a pass in pornography. There are racial depictions in pornography that if they were to appear on a television show, that television network would be flooded with complaints and would shut down. But they go unnoticed in porn. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Part of it is because this sexualizing of domination and subordination works very, very well in sexualizing race, where we have notions about dominant and subordinate. But it's also, I think, because, and this is where I'll end up, we are so terrified to talk about this. Right? People who would not hesitate to critique a Hollywood film for its racism will go mute about the racism in pornography. People who would not be hesitant to critique the way that women are the victims of sexualized violence in a Hollywood movie will go mute around the question in pornography. There's something about this realm that we have been scared of engaging. And again, I don't think it's because we're scared of sex in that sort of superficial sense. I think the reason we don't talk about porn at this level is because we're afraid of what it will tell us about ourselves, what it will tell us about the culture we've built, what it will tell us about those aspects of patriarchy that we have been afraid to confront. And I don't know any way to deal with what we're scared of except to face it. In your own personal life, when you're afraid of something, has it worked to avoid it? Oh yeah, I'll just avoid that really difficult issue I'm having with my parents, and that will resolve it. Right? I'll just avoid this really difficult underlying conflict I have with my best friend, and that will resolve it. No. What doesn't work in our personal lives does not work in our collective life. And I don't think until we start confronting this at both the political and the moral level, we're going to have much luck with it at all. And here, let me make as a parting comment, to suggest that a place like the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University is a really good place to do this, because you have a grounding in a theological tradition that, for all of its occasional craziness, if you'll accept that good-natured critique, right? For all of the problems that revolve around sexuality in the Catholic tradition and the Christian tradition more generally, there is a progressive and really, I think, really deeply noble tradition there as well. And unearthing that and putting it in that secular and political context, which you all also come out of, means that places like this, I think, are kind of uniquely positioned to work on these kinds of issues in ways that can change. So that's my suggestion. You all figure this out, get it all worked out, and then send me a report by the end of the semester about how we're going to resolve it. And I'll start following the revolution that began right here at St. John's and St. Ben's. So with that, again, I just want to thank all of the folks I've met today who've been really a lot of fun, and especially Shane and the Gender Studies department here, which, based on my limited experience today is doing really, really incredible work. If you've never taken a course in the Gender Studies program, I really would highly recommend it, not just because I think the subject is important, but because you've got some really amazing faculty here, and you should take advantage of them. So thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. or just chat, I'm happy.